The deadliest wars are often those fought with the highest ideals. In the early days of World War II, the United States Army Air Forces, USAAF, promoted a singular, unwavering doctrine: precision daylight bombing. The theory was elegant and morally compelling. Instead of the indiscriminate night bombing raids conducted by the British Royal Air Force, American strategic bombers would deliver their payload with surgical accuracy, destroying only military targets, factories, power plants, and naval yards, thereby crippling the enemy's war machine while minimizing civilian casualties. This doctrine was not just a tactical choice. It was a deeply held belief, a moral distinction that America sought to maintain in a world descending into moral grayness. The entire strategy, the very moral foundation of the U.S. air war, rested upon one piece of technology: the Norden Bombsight. It was shrouded in immense secrecy, a device so complex and so prized that it was colloquially referred to as the device that would win the war. It was more than an instrument. It was a promise that technology could overcome the chaotic realities of combat and deliver salvation through surgical precision. The cost of this promise was staggering, eventually exceeding $1.5 billion in 1940s currency, a sum that underscores the profound faith placed in its capabilities. Designed by a Dutch engineer, Carl L. Norden, the sight was a triumph of mechanical ingenuity, an analog computer capable of calculating the complex variables necessary to drop a bomb from miles above the Earth and place it precisely on target. Every aspect of the Norden Bombsight's operational deployment was cloaked in ritualistic secrecy. Bombardiers were required to take an oath to protect the device with their lives, sworn to destroy the mechanism should their aircraft be forced down over enemy territory. The bomb sights themselves were removed from the aircraft immediately upon landing, carried under armed guard to secure vaults, reinforcing the idea that this was not merely equipment, but a sacred technological talisman, the embodiment of the moral clarity of the American mission. The narrative promoted by the Army Air Forces was captivating. The Norden could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. This ambitious claim captured the imagination of the American public and the confidence of the military command, establishing a deeply entrenched doctrine that would prove incredibly costly when tested by the cruel, pragmatic realities of the European sky. The stage was set for a massive, catastrophic disconnect between the ambition of the machine and its actual performance in the unpredictable theater of combat. This fundamental reliance on a single, untested device would become the most critical tactical vulnerability of the early U.S. bombing campaign. The initial, disastrous combat reports would reveal that the precise, sterile world of the testing lab bore no resemblance to the smoky, windswept skies over Germany, a revelation that shook the very core of the U.S. air strategy. The mythos surrounding the Norden Bombsight, the promise of dropping a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet, was meticulously crafted by the military to secure funding and establish its strategic doctrine. This narrative, however, became an institutional vulnerability. The bombsight was an astonishing piece of mechanical engineering, essentially an analog computer that factored in the bomber's altitude, airspeed, wind direction, and velocity, the Earth's curvature, and the time of the bomb's fall. The bombardier would manually input data, while the bombsight, working in conjunction with the Sperry autopilot, would take over control of the aircraft in the final moments of the bomb run, flying the plane with a precision no human pilot could match. This synergistic relationship, the mechanical brain guiding the steel bird, was the core of the precision doctrine. However, the conditions under which this near-perfect accuracy was achieved were limited exclusively to clear, calm, high-altitude tests over the desert landscapes of the American Southwest. These ideal conditions were profoundly misleading. The fundamental flaw was operational, not technical. The Norden required a straight, level, and uninterrupted run of several minutes over the target. This ideal flight path was instantaneously shattered the moment the aircraft entered the European theater. The reality was a sky choked with flak, teeming with aggressive Luftwaffe fighters and obscured by the persistent cloud cover and the dense industrial smoke generated by the very targets the bombers were attempting to hit. The notion that a bomber could maintain a precise 5-minute straight-line approach over a hostile target, unmolested by enemy fire, was a deadly fantasy. The pressure of enemy fighters, the necessity of evasive maneuvers, and the unpredictable wind currents at altitude immediately rendered the Norden's complex calculations obsolete. The mechanism, designed for the quiet precision of the lab, was paralyzed by the chaos of combat. The bombardiers, trained to trust the machine absolutely, quickly realized that the reality of war demanded compromise. The stringent secrecy surrounding the device also had a profound, negative tactical impact. The Navy, having developed its own distinct version of the Norden for anti-submarine warfare, was strictly prohibited from sharing data or coordinating technology with the Army Air Forces. This institutional rivalry meant that crucial technological lessons and operational feedback were never integrated across the services, leading to duplicated errors and wasted time. The strategic implications were catastrophic. The U.S. commitment to daylight precision bombing, predicated on the Norden's mythical capability, locked the Air Force into a dangerous pattern of high-altitude vulnerability. The bomber crews were betting their lives on a promise that the machine, under combat duress, could not keep. The operational deployment of the Norden Bombsight quickly generated a vast chasm between official expectations and grim reality. The early combat reports from the 8th Air Force stationed in England, flying raids over occupied Europe, painted a picture of devastating tactical failure. The primary culprit was the very environmental reality the Norden was designed to ignore: weather. The relentless cloud cover over industrial Germany and occupied Europe made the necessary visual identification of targets impossible for the bombardier. The Norden was, at its core, an optical instrument. It required the bombardier to visually sight the target, if the bombardier could not see the factory or the railway yard. The Norden Bombsight was reduced to an extremely complex, expensive paperweight. Over time, statistical analysis of bombing accuracy revealed the startling truth. While the Norden could indeed achieve near-perfect accuracy under ideal testing conditions, the combat average for the 8th Air Force raids showed that barely 20% of bombs fell within a 1,000-foot circle of the aiming point. This meant that the U.S. commitment to surgical precision was, in practice, no more accurate than the British strategy of nighttime area saturation bombing. Yet the U.S. suffered far heavier losses due to the daylight exposure. The strategic cost of this failure was compounded by the bureaucratic insistence on maintaining the pre-war precision doctrine. Commanders were under immense pressure to validate the enormous financial and political investment in the bombsight. As a result, missions were frequently launched despite adverse weather conditions, relying on inaccurate target estimations or bombing on the leader, where only the lead aircraft used its Norden and the following aircraft simply dropped their payload when the leader did. This tactic further diluted accuracy and made the entire mission vulnerable to simple navigational error. The operational reality forced bombardiers into a continuous state of desperate improvisation. They often relied on sheer guesswork, rudimentary mapping techniques, or simply waiting for a brief gap in the clouds. The machine that was supposed to remove human error from bombing now magnified it, creating a dangerous dependency on an instrument that only worked under non-existent ideal conditions. The commitment to the Norden's mythical precision effectively locked the U.S. Air Forces into a strategy that demanded clear skies, a luxury rarely afforded by the European climate. The promise of the pickle barrel had dissolved into the smog and cloud cover over the German industrial heartland, leaving the bomber crews vulnerable, exposed, and ultimately ineffective in achieving the stated goal of surgical air superiority. The human element was perhaps the most crucial and least understood variable in the Norden Bombsight's operational chain. The Army Air Forces instituted a highly secretive and rigorous training program for bombardiers, instilling in them an almost religious reverence for the machine. The training emphasized mechanical precision, demanding absolute faith in the Norden's mathematical output. Yet, this high-pressure, secrecy-laden training did little to prepare the bombardiers for the overwhelming sensory chaos of the combat environment. The bombardiers' task, even when the target was visible, was monumentally stressful. Lying prone in the nose of the bomber, exposed to the elements and the relentless anti-aircraft fire, the bombardier had to manually track the target through the Norden's optics, inputting real-time corrections for wind drift and airspeed. This required an intense, unwavering concentration that was virtually impossible to maintain when the aircraft was being violently buffeted by flak and pursued by enemy fighters. The machine's design demanded a precision that the human body under duress simply could not provide. The slightest flinch, the briefest loss of concentration caused by an exploding shell, or the need for the pilot to execute a sudden, life-saving, evasive maneuver, instantly invalidated the delicate calculations of the analog computer. The operational doctrine demanded an ideal, straight-line approach for several minutes, a death sentence for the unescorted bomber. The pressure on the individual bombardier was immense. He was, in essence, holding the fate of the entire mission and his crew in his hands during the final, critical moments. The intense secrecy surrounding the Norden also created deep psychological burdens. The bombardier was sworn to destroy the device if the aircraft was compromised, a dangerous, often impossible task under emergency conditions. Many carried specially weighted .45 caliber pistols to shoot the intricate mechanism, a desperate contingency plan that speaks to the profound vulnerability associated with the technology. The human body and mind became the weakest link in the chain, not due to incompetence, but due to the machine's refusal to adapt to the reality of warfare. The Norden was a masterpiece of analog computing, but its failure to integrate the human stress factor into its operational matrix meant that the very precision it promised was perpetually elusive, turning the bombardier into a sacrificial specialist whose expertise was often nullified by the simple, brutal forces of fear and chaos. The strategic implications of the Norden bombsight's failure became glaringly apparent by mid-1943. The U.S. commitment to daylight precision bombing was failing on its own terms. The operational reality forced the USAAF to reluctantly abandon the core tenets of its precision doctrine and shift towards area saturation bombing, the very tactic they had condemned the British for using. The statistical data was unequivocal. The average circular error for American daylight raids was far too large to justify the heavy bomber losses. The promise of surgical strikes had yielded only diffuse destruction. This failure necessitated a fundamental and highly controversial strategic compromise. Unable to consistently hit specific factories or power stations, the Air Force was forced to designate large industrial areas or city sectors as targets. The mission objective transitioned from destroying the enemy's capacity to wage war to simply destroying the enemy's ability to sustain industrial output, a shift that blurred the moral line the U.S. had initially sought to define. The shift was accelerated by the increasing vulnerability of unescorted B-17 flying fortresses to Luftwaffe fighters deep inside German airspace. The heavy losses sustained during early, unescorted raids, such as the disastrous Schweinfurt raid, underscored the fact that precision bombing, as practiced, was unsustainable. The failure of the Norden to reliably deliver on its promise meant that the bomber stream had to rely on mutual defensive firepower rather than tactical evasion. The ultimate compromise came with the introduction of new technologies designed to counteract the Norden's optical limitations. The development and integration of H-2X radar bombing allowed bombers to target large cities and industrial clusters through cloud cover or smoke. but only at the expense of true pinpoint accuracy. H-2X, nicknamed the Mickey, relied on ground echoes and provided resolution only accurate enough to bomb large targets, cementing the move towards area bombing. The strategic reliance on the Norden had severely restricted the USAAF's tactical flexibility for 2 crucial years. The eventual move to radar-assisted area bombing and the necessity of massive fighter escorts, the P-51 Mustang being the ultimate solution to the bomber's vulnerability, were indirect but profound consequences of the bombsight's failure. The ambition of winning the war with a flawless mechanical brain had been crushed by the chaos of combat, forcing the U.S. Air Command to accept a far more costly and destructive reality. The strategic cost of the Norden bombsight's failure was financial, operational, and most profoundly, moral. The sheer financial investment, estimated at $1.5 billion, was squandered on a device that performed only marginally better than simpler, cheaper alternatives under combat conditions. The operational cost was measured in the lives of the bomber crews. The inflexible adherence to the precision doctrine dictated by the limitations of the Norden led to devastating losses on missions where the straight, level bomb run exposed the aircraft to relentless anti-aircraft fire and fighter attack. The necessity of flying through cloud cover, despite the Norden's ineffectiveness in such conditions, compounded the problem, as bombers often flew circuitous routes, wasting fuel and risking interception simply to maintain the illusion of precision. The most significant moral cost was the abandonment of the U.S. commitment to surgical warfare. The initial promise of the Norden had been to win the war without resorting to the indiscriminate destruction characteristic of the European conflict. The final reality was that the U.S. air war evolved into a massive, costly campaign of area saturation bombing, culminating in the firebombing of cities like Dresden and Tokyo. The technological promise had failed to uphold the moral distinction. The extensive secrecy surrounding the Norden bombsight also carried a hidden cost. The extreme measures taken to protect the device, including the risk of court-martial for the bombardier who failed to destroy it, created unnecessary stress and operational difficulties. Furthermore, the secrecy meant that the valuable operational feedback gained from the front lines was slow to reach the engineers, hindering necessary improvements and prolonging the use of the flawed technology. The Norden bombsight became a stark illustration of the dangers of technological fetishism in warfare. It was a beautiful piece of engineering that failed to account for the human and environmental variables of combat. The U.S. military had placed its entire strategic air war on a pedestal built on theoretical perfection, and the cruel reality of the European sky had violently knocked it down. The eventual shift away from reliance on the Norden was not a technological triumph, but a reluctant admission of strategic defeat, forcing the Air Force to pivot toward solutions that prioritized the survival of the crews and the sheer volume of destruction over the dream of surgical precision. The secrecy surrounding the Norden bombsight, while intended to protect a critical national asset, ultimately proved to be a liability that hindered the U.S. war effort in subtle but profound ways. The strict rules governing the handling and deployment of the device created a massive logistical burden and psychological pressure on the air crews. Bombardiers were required to carry specific tools and explosive charges to ensure the destruction of the site in case of a crash landing, a dangerous and often impossible task under emergency conditions. This ritualistic secrecy reinforced the idea of the Norden as an almost mystical object, further entrenching the myth of its infallibility within the military bureaucracy. The cost of this secrecy extended beyond internal operations. The institutional rivalry between the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy meant that crucial operational data regarding the Norden was fiercely guarded and rarely, if ever, shared. The Navy, operating in the Pacific, required a similar precision bombing capability for anti-ship and submarine warfare. Yet they were forced to develop their own separate, slightly different versions of the technology, duplicating effort and wasting valuable time and resources. This lack of coordination meant that neither service fully benefited from the operational lessons learned by the other. the most significant cost of the secrecy was the impediment to technological advancement. The extreme classification meant that outside engineers and scientists, including leading minds in radar and early digital computing, were often unaware of the Norden's operational failures and were restricted from offering or integrating potential solutions. For 2 crucial years, the military relied on the analog machine, dismissing the potential of radar-assisted bombing because it lacked the optical precision the Norden promised. The integration of the H-2X radar system, which eventually revolutionized bombing in adverse weather, was severely delayed by the entrenched belief in the Norden's ultimate supremacy. The technological failure of the Norden Bombsight was amplified by the bureaucratic secrecy that sustained its mythology. The U.S. war machine had invested so heavily in the idea of the Norden that it became politically impossible to admit its shortcomings and embrace a different, more effective technological path. The secrecy shielded the technology from the enemy, but far more damagingly, it shielded the technology from necessary scrutiny and improvement by its own experts. The eventual shift away from the singular reliance on the Norden Bombsight marked a reluctant, yet necessary, strategic evolution for the USAF. The change was not driven by a singular technological breakthrough, but by the devastating combination of continuous heavy losses and the undeniable statistical evidence of the Norden's failure to deliver the promised precision. By late 1943 and early 1944, the USAF began incorporating the H-2X radar bombing system, a technology derived from the British H-2S system. H-2X, nicknamed the Mickey, provided the bombers with the ability to locate and target large industrial clusters or cities through the dense cloud cover that perpetually plagued Europe. This was a critical operational improvement, as it minimized the number of scrubbed missions and allowed for a far more consistent bombing campaign, removing the dependency on clear skies. However, this adoption was a profound strategic compromise. H-2X, which relied on ground echoes, lacked the resolution necessary to identify individual factories or specific military installations. Its accuracy was limited to general areas, large targets like ports, marshalling yards, or entire urban centers. The adoption of H-2X officially cemented the transition of the U.S. air strategy from precision bombing to area saturation bombing. The goal had shifted from surgically destroying the enemy's means of production to systematically destroying its overall industrial and urban capacity. The very strategy the USAF had initially deemed morally and tactically inferior to the British approach. This strategic pivot was a direct, irrefutable consequence of the Norden's failure to perform under real-world conditions. Furthermore, the integration of H-2X created a significant reliance on the bomber stream's ability to maintain formation, as H-2X was initially only carried by a few specialized lead aircraft. The remaining bombers would drop their payloads when the radar leader released its bombs. This tactic, known as bombing on the leader, made the entire formation vulnerable to the successful disruption of the lead aircraft. The ultimate solution to the bomber's vulnerability came not from a bombing instrument, but from the successful deployment of the long-range fighter escort, specifically the P-51 Mustang. The ability of the Mustangs to accompany the bombers deep into German airspace provided the defensive protection necessary to sustain the massive area bombing campaign. The Norden Bombsight, once the technological center of the U.S. air strategy, was relegated to a supplementary role, used only when clear visibility permitted, a final, costly footnote to an expensive and ultimately failed promise. The institutional ramifications of the Norden Bombsight's failure extended far beyond the battlefield, reshaping the philosophy of military procurement and strategic planning. The realization that the nation had invested such immense resources and strategic credibility in a fundamentally flawed piece of technology sparked a painful, comprehensive internal review. The post-mortem highlighted the critical danger of allowing design engineers, those with an inherent, vested interest in the product, to dictate the testing protocols. The failure exposed a systemic weakness in the military's pre-war culture, which had favored theoretical perfection and budgetary efficiency over rigorous, realistic operational testing. The resolution forced a fundamental change in the U.S. military-industrial complex. New protocols were implemented, mandating independent operational testing of all critical weapons systems by separate, disinterested branches of the service. This ensured that design flaws, whether technical or operational, were identified and corrected by objective parties who were not invested in the program's success. Furthermore, the failure underscored the critical need for technological diversification. The U.S. realized the peril of resting its entire strategic air doctrine on a single optical instrument. This recognition accelerated the funding and adoption of complementary technologies, such as radar and inertial guidance systems, ensuring that future strategic capabilities were not dependent on the whims of weather or the limitations of a single technology. The influence of the Norden's failure was surprisingly felt across the war effort. The Germans, who managed to acquire the technological secrets of the Norden through espionage and crashed bombers, were initially misled by the American faith in the device's pinpoint accuracy. They dedicated resources to countermeasures designed to defend specific, individual targets, rather than preparing for the eventual reality of massive area saturation attacks. The propaganda surrounding the Norden initially served as an effective psychological weapon against the enemy, causing them to misallocate vital defensive resources. However, the eventual capture of the technology, coupled with the reality of the diffuse bombing patterns, allowed German intelligence to correctly deduce the limitations of the U.S. precision doctrine. Ultimately, the most profound legacy of the Norden Bombsight was its contribution to a new, sobering realism within the U.S. military. The device became the permanent symbol of the peril of technological hubris, ensuring that future strategic plans were built not on mythical promises, but on the pragmatic, hard-won lessons of the chaotic combat environment. The final after-action report on the Norden Bombsight offers a critical, enduring lesson about the nature of ambition and reality in warfare. The story is a monument to misplaced faith, technological hubris, and the ultimate victory of chaos over calculation. The device itself, a marvel of analog engineering, was rendered obsolete not by enemy action, but by the irreducible variables of the European sky: the smoke, the clouds, the flak, and the human element. The initial ambition, to win the war with moral clarity through surgical precision, was crushed by the machine's fatal dependency on ideal, non-existent conditions. The immense financial investment of $1.5 billion and the strategic credibility placed in the Norden were ultimately sacrificed on the altar of technological overpromise. The final strategic pivot to area bombing, relying on the blunt instrument of radar and sheer volume of ordnance, was an admission that the war required brute force, not surgical elegance. Yet, the Norden saga contributed profoundly to the future of warfare. It accelerated the adoption of radar bombing techniques, established the precedent for rigorous, independent testing protocols, and underscored the absolute necessity of reliable, long-range fighter escorts. The technological shortcomings of the bombsight directly fueled the development of systems that eventually made true precision targeting possible in later conflicts. The device, once sworn to secrecy, is now displayed in museums, a physical testament to a failed promise. It stands as a permanent reminder that in the arena of war, a weapon's value is determined not by its theoretical sophistication in the laboratory, but by its unflinching reliability in the mud, the chaos, and the unrelenting fire of the combat zone. The greatest flaw of the Norden Bombsight was not in its gears or its optics, but in the institutional belief that technology could entirely conquer the unpredictable human and environmental realities of war. The war was ultimately won, not by a single perfect device, but by the resilience, skill, and sheer volume of men and machines adapting to the brutal truth of the conflict. This remains the core lesson of the final after-action report.